Steel-clad boots echoed in the pre-dawn stillness of May 31st in the year 1431. Each heavy thud reverberated through the damp cold stones of her cell deep within the tower of Rouen castle. A young woman, barely 19 years old, named Joan, listened, her breath catching in her throat. She knew those steps. They were the harbingers of a fate that had been hanging over her for nearly a year. For 11 long months she had been a prisoner. 11 months in iron shackles binding her ankles day and night, tied her to a wooden post in the floor. 11 months in this cramped, frigid chamber, under the ceaseless, hateful scrutiny of English soldiers. Their glares, their murmurs, their very presence, a constant reminder of the countless compatriots she had sent to their graves on the battlefield. For 11 months, she had endured interrogations crafted with cruel precision, designed not to seek truth, but to dismantle her credibility, shatter her sanity, and break her unbreakable spirit. Now, finally, the inevitable moment had arrived, a certainty everyone had known since the instant of her capture. They were coming to lead her to the old market square of Rouen, to be consumed by flames before a crowd of thousands. But the story of Joan of Arc, the peasant girl condemned as a witch, was not merely about her final agonizing hours. It was a searing testament to a period of captivity that exposed the raw, brutal mechanisms of medieval power and the extraordinary resilience of one young woman caught within its merciless gears. How did a simple girl from a forgotten village come to such a tragic end? Her journey began far from the stone walls of Rouen, in a small French hamlet called Domremy, around the year 1412. She was the daughter of Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romet, honest peasants who, though not wealthy, owned enough land to sustain their family. Their lives were interwoven with the rhythm of the seasons, the tilling of fields, and the care of their livestock. But Joan's childhood was overshadowed by the 100 Years' War, a devastating generational conflict between England and France that had carved vast swaths of her homeland into perpetual battlegrounds. The countryside was a tapestry of fear. Roaming bands of soldiers plundered villages, scorched fertile harvests, and brought unspeakable terror to the women. Farmers lived under a constant, suffocating dread, never knowing when the next wave of destruction would sweep through. Joan, like any peasant girl of the 15th century, learned the essential skills of her station: how to sew intricate stitches, how to shepherd animals, how to manage a humble household. What she did not learn, however, was to read or write, a detail her future interrogators would wield against her, claiming that her astonishing military feats were impossible for an illiterate farm girl and therefore could only be the work of malevolent witchcraft.
Her extraordinary path truly began at the tender age of 13. It was then, she testified years later, that she first heard the voices, clear, distinct, and undeniably divine. She identified them as Saint Catherine of Alexandria, Saint Margaret of Antioch, and the revered Archangel Michael. These celestial messengers delivered an astonishing command. She had a sacred mission. She was to save France, liberate the besieged city of Orleans, and lead the Dauphin Charles to his rightful coronation in Reims. For 3 long years, Joan kept these profound, bewildering experiences a guarded secret, wrestling with the meaning and the terrifying weight of their prophecy. But in the year 1428, when she was 16, the voices grew undeniably insistent, their urgency echoing the escalating crisis around her. Her own village was attacked by Burgundian forces, allies of the English, forcing her family to flee temporarily. The Dauphin Charles, the legitimate heir to the French throne, was virtually trapped in Bourges, his claim to the crown challenged, his kingdom fracturing into 1,000 pieces. France was on the brink of complete collapse. Driven by an unshakable faith, Joan finally revealed her mission, first convincing her uncle, Durand Laxad, to take her to Vaucouleurs. There, a formidable captain named Robert de Bouricourt commanded a garrison loyal to the beleaguered Dauphin. Joan, with a directness that belied her youth, requested an audience and boldly declared that she needed to see the Dauphin because God himself had commanded her to save France. Baudricourt, a hardened soldier, initially scoffed, dismissing her with a crude jest, telling her to return home and instructing her father to give her a good slap. But Joan was not easily deterred. She returned weeks later, her conviction undimmed, and this time she offered a chillingly specific prediction. The French army would soon suffer a terrible defeat near Orleans. Days later, news arrived confirming her precise prophecy: the Battle of Rouen, where a French supply convoy was utterly destroyed. Impressed by the accuracy of her foresight, or perhaps simply desperate enough to grasp at any straw, Baudricourt finally relented. He provided Joan with an escort of 6 loyal men for the arduous 11-day journey through treacherous hostile territory to Chinon, where the Dauphin's court sought refuge. In February of 1429, a 17-year-old peasant girl, unable to read or write, arrived at the heart of French royalty. She wore men's clothing, a pragmatic necessity, for she had swiftly learned that traveling as a woman through war-torn lands was fraught with extreme peril.
Remarkably, she obtained a private audience with the Dauphin Charles. Even more remarkably, after that intensely private conversation, the full details of which Joan would never fully disclose, Charles, clearly moved by her conviction, decided to submit her to an examination by a panel of theologians in Poitiers. Their task was to discern whether her claims were genuinely divine or merely the delusion of a peasant girl. After 3 exhaustive weeks of interrogations, the learned theologians delivered their verdict. They could find nothing inherently wrong with her. Given the dire, almost hopeless situation of France, they concluded Charles had nothing to lose by entrusting her with a chance, by testing whether God had indeed sent her as a miraculous intervention. And so Joan of Arc was outfitted for war. She received a suit of armor, a distinctive white banner emblazoned with golden fleurs-de-lis and the sacred names of Jesus and Mary, and an escort of seasoned soldiers. Her destination, Orleans, a city of immense strategic importance that had been under relentless English siege for months. If Orleans fell, the English would gain an open road to the south, and France would almost certainly lose the war forever. Joan arrived at the beleaguered city on April 29, 1429. Her very presence, a beacon of divinely inspired hope, electrified and galvanized the demoralized French troops. In a breathtaking series of daring assaults that raged from May 4th to May 7th, the French forces, infused with a newfound courage, systematically captured the English forts encircling a city. Joan participated actively in the thick of the combat, not as a remote commander, but as an inspirational figure, holding her distinctive banner aloft, her voice ringing out with fervent orders, urging the soldiers to press the advance. She was wounded by an arrow that pierced her shoulder, but with a display of incredible fortitude, she returned to the fray after it was hastily removed. By May 8, the English, their morale shattered, lifted the siege and retreated. France had achieved its first truly significant victory in years, and a teenage peasant girl had, against all odds, been transformed into a national heroine. Over the next 2 months, Joan continued to lead her troops in a triumphant military campaign, capturing a string of cities and towns along the Loire River. Each victory cleared another crucial stretch of the path to Reims, the traditional city of French coronations. On July 17, 1429, the culmination of her mission arrived. Charles VII was crowned King of France in the majestic Cathedral of Reims, with Joan of Arc standing proudly by his side, her white banner held high.
It was the absolute zenith of her life, a moment of unparalleled glory and divine fulfillment. At just 17 years old, she had ascended from an anonymous peasant to the central, inspiring figure in the salvation of her country. She had seen the sacred mission her voices had entrusted to her brought to its glorious completion. Yet the voices, in their wisdom, had not told her to stop. And Joan, perhaps, did not know how to be anything other than the warrior and messenger she had become during those extraordinary, miraculous months. Her journey had reached its peak, but the path ahead remained unwritten. shrouded in an uncertain future. The coronation at Reims was Joan's triumph, the culmination of a divine mission. But the euphoria, like a fleeting dream, soon evaporated. The voices, her steadfast guides, had commanded her to crown the king, but they offered no instructions on what to do next. Joan, a warrior forged by divine purpose, found herself adrift, unable to shed the identity that had saved France. She continued her military campaigns, but the tide had irrevocably turned. The once invincible aura surrounding her began to fade. In September, her audacious assault on Paris met with crushing failure. Joan, once miraculously protected, was wounded again, this time by an arrow piercing her thigh. The tactical brilliance and divine favor that had marked her earlier victories seemed to abandon her. More critically, deep fissures began to appear between her and the professional military commanders. Many resented taking orders from a peasant girl, however heroic. Their deference, born of desperation and awe, slowly gave way to jealousy and professional pride. King Charles VII, now securely crowned and consolidating his fragile power, no longer seemed inclined to gamble everything on Joan's aggressive, divinely inspired offensives. His political calculations had shifted, his need for a miraculous symbol had diminished. Joan, who had once stood at the heart of the kingdom's salvation, felt herself increasingly isolated, a potent but inconvenient anomaly in the intricate world of court politics and military strategy. Then the final, brutal blow landed. On May 23 in the year 1430, during a desperate attempt to defend the strategic city of Compiègne from a relentless Burgundian assault, Joan's luck rang out. She was at the rear, courageously covering the retreat of her French troops, when Burgundian soldiers, allies of the English, swarmed around her. One, bolder than the rest, pulled her roughly from her horse, his hands clutching her long tunic. She fought back fiercely with the same unyielding spirit that had faced down armies, but she was overwhelmed. In a cruel twist of fate, her own troops, seeing her capture, closed the city gates, locking her outside, abandoning her. Perhaps the garrison commander, faced with an impossible choice, deemed the city's safety paramount, a tragic sacrifice.
Joan was dragged away, a prisoner, to the castle of Beaulieu-les-Fontaines, a holding of Jean of Luxembourg, a powerful Burgundian nobleman. For the English, news of her capture was nothing short of a divine gift. This woman, who had humiliated their proud armies, who had transformed French morale with a flicker of hope, who had been the very face of their most humiliating defeats, was now in the hands of their allies. Negotiations to purchase her began immediately. The sums discussed were astronomical, a staggering 10,000 livres tournois, a ransom befitting a royal prince. Jean of Luxembourg, despite his alliance, wavered. He had family members who felt a grudging sympathy for Joan, or perhaps simply saw the injustice of her impending fate. But the relentless political pressure from the English, coupled with the extraordinary, irresistible sum of money, ultimately proved too powerful. In November of 1430, Joan was formally sold to the English. Her transfer was swift and merciless. She was taken to Rouen Castle, the formidable capital of English-occupied France. Rouen was no ordinary prison. It was a sprawling, fortified military complex, the very seat of English power in France, home to hundreds of soldiers who had fought against the French, men who saw Joan as the living embodiment of everything that had gone wrong in their war. It was within these walls, under absolute English control, that Joan of Arc would spend the final 11 months of her short life. Her cell, a grim stone room measuring approximately 3 by 3 meters, was located deep within one of the castle's towers. A single small window, set high in the wall, offered a sliver of light, but no escape. Here, Joan was kept in constant, brutal bondage. Heavy iron shackles bound her ankles, connected by a short, unforgiving chain to a stout wooden post fixed immovably in the floor.
During the long, terrifying nights, additional shackles were clamped onto her wrists. This was not the standard treatment for a prisoner of war. Even high-value captives, once a ransom negotiation was established, typically received more dignified conditions. But Joan was not treated as a soldier. She was branded a criminal, a heretic, a witch. And to drive home this brutal distinction, she was placed under the relentless, degrading guard of 5 English soldiers, day and night. They were not stationed outside her cell, as would have been appropriate for a young woman. They were inside the very room, observing her every move, her every moment.
Joan was afforded no privacy whatsoever for any bodily function. There was no separation, no barrier between her and these men who had been her sworn enemies on the battlefield, men whose hostility was palpable. The official records of her trial, with chilling casualness, mention this arrangement as if it were entirely normal. Yet multiple witnesses, testifying years later at her rehabilitation trial, identified Miss' specific condition as cruelly unusual and deliberately engineered to humiliate and terrorize her into submission. Jean de Mailly, one of the clerics involved in her trial, who later bore witness to the horrific truth, testified a quarter-century after her death. He recounted hearing Joan complain, her voice filled with despair, that her guards repeatedly attempted to touch her during the night. Another witness, Jean Tressard, a physician summoned when Joan fell ill during her captivity, testified that she confided in him a harrowing detail. An English lord, possibly identified as the Earl of Warwick or the Earl of Stafford, had physically assaulted her. Guillaume Manchon, the principal notary who meticulously recorded the trial proceedings, provided further damning testimony. He stated unequivocally that Joan was in constant danger from her guards. This grave threat, he explained, was precisely why she clung so desperately to her male clothing. The trousers and tightly tied tunics, unlike a flowing dress, could be secured in such a way as to provide at least some physical protection against aggressive assault. This, then, unveils one of the most perplexing and frequently misunderstood aspects of her trial for modern observers, the interrogators' almost obsessive fixation on Joan's clothing. They barraged her with repeated questions about why she insisted on wearing men's attire. They thundered that it was a grave sin, a defiance of God's laws and natural order, and threatened to condemn her on this transgression alone. To a 21st century theologian, such a charge might appear trivial or merely symbolic, but in the harrowing context of her imprisonment, her male clothing was quite literally her only defense against sexual violence. To strip her of those garments was to strip her of the last desperate barrier of physical protection she possessed. It was a calculated act of dehumanization, a precursor to the ultimate violation.
The trial of Joan of Arc commenced officially on February 21st in the year 1431. Presiding over this formidable legal and spiritual arena was Pierre Cauchon, the formidable Bishop of Beauvais, a 60-year-old cleric whose loyalty to the English and their Burgundian allies was absolute and unwavering. Cauchon harbored a deep personal vendetta against Joan. He had been expelled from his own diocese when the French reconquered it, losing both his income and his esteemed position, all thanks to Joan and other commanders like her. He had every conceivable interest in seeing her condemned. To ensure his desired outcome, Cauchon assembled an imposing tribunal of dozens of theologians, doctors of canon law, and influential representatives from the prestigious University of Paris. On the surface, it was presented as a legitimate legal process of the Church, designed to determine if Joan was indeed a heretic. In brutal reality, it was a meticulously orchestrated political trial, engineered from its very inception to produce a predetermined conviction. This conviction would serve a dual purpose. It would legitimize her execution and, perhaps even more importantly, discredit King Charles VII by arguing that he had been crowned with the illicit aid of a witch. The interrogation sessions were grueling, protracted, and utterly exhaustive. Joan was brought from her cold, damp cell, still burdened by her iron shackles, and seated before scores of learned men. These scholars relentlessly bombarded her with complex theological questions, each one carefully designed to ensnare her in contradictions and trap her in a web of heresy.
They pressed her about the true nature of her voices. How could she be certain they came from God and not from demons? Did she see them in bodily form? What did she ask them, and what were their precise replies? They probed about her male clothing, about her personal involvement in killing enemies in battle, and whether her voices had promised her salvation. These were insidious top questions. If she claimed absolute certainty about her salvation, it would be deemed heretical presumption. If she expressed any doubt, it would contradict her earlier affirmations of faithfully following divine orders. And Joan, a 19-year-old illiterate peasant girl, utterly devoid of any formal legal or theological training, faced these formidable interrogators with a composure and intellect that later chroniclers would recognize as extraordinarily astute.
Quinn asked if she was in a state of grace, another expertly laid trap, for asserting certainty was heresy, yet denying it implied unsuitability for a divine mission. She famously replied with an answer that silenced her accusers. If I am not, may God put me in it. If I am, may God keep me in it. When they demanded to know if her voices had promised her escape from prison, she retorted, "Must I tell you that? That is part of your process." When they attempted to confuse her with convoluted theological concepts, she frequently responded with defiant simplicity. "You ask the clerics about that. I only know what my voices told me." But between these formal recorded sessions, in the endless silent hours of her cell, there were no scribes, no clerics diligently recording her every word. There were only the 5 English guards, the unyielding chain on her ankles, the pervasive dampness of the stone, and the creeping, undeniable certainty of how this nightmare would end. Several of the clerics who participated in the trial later expressed profound discomfort with the conditions of her incarceration. Jean Lemaire, a respected Norman jurist who reviewed the proceedings, declared the entire trial invalid for multiple reasons. Chief among them was the fact that Joan was held in a secular military prison rather than an ecclesiastical one, as was strictly required for heresy trials. He pointed out that this arrangement left her devastatingly vulnerable to abuses and made it impossible for her to adequately defend herself while constantly terrified for her physical safety. Cauchon, with chilling resolve, utterly ignored these objections. In fact, when the Bishop of Rennes offered to transfer Joan to an ecclesiastical prison where she could be under the custody of religious women, Cauchon flatly rejected the offer. He wanted Joan precisely where she was, vulnerable, isolated, and utterly breakable. In April of 1431, after 2 months of intensive, relentless interrogations, the tribunal produced a damning document containing 70 accusations against Joan. These were later pared down to 12 principal charges, among them wearing men's clothing, believing her voices came directly from God without the mediation of the church, leaving her parents without permission, and, shockingly, attempted suicide. They had omitted this charge previously. During her initial captivity at Bulbo Castle, Joan had, in a desperate act of defiance, jumped from a tower, preferring death to being sold to the English. She survived a 20-meter fall but remained unconscious for days. The other charges included various accusations related to heresy, idolatry, and invoking demons.
On May 24th, Joan was led to the cemetery of St. Owen Abbey, where 2 platforms had been hastily constructed. One was for the judges and clerics, the other for Joan herself. Before her stretched a vast crowd of hundreds, a sea of hostile and curious faces. The accusations were read aloud, and she was informed that if she did not retract her alleged errors, she would be handed over to the secular arm, the English civil government, for execution. Guillaume Hérard, a prominent preacher, then delivered a scathing sermon, publicly denouncing Joan as a heretic, a witch, and a traitor. He thundered that not only she, but also King Charles, who had trusted her, were guilty of heresy and crimes against God. At this point, Joan began to weep. She had endured months of grueling captivity, constant interrogations, relentless threats, and the terror of nightly assault attempts in her cell. Now, surrounded by overwhelming hostility and facing the imminent horror of the pyre, her extraordinary resistance momentarily fractured. When presented with a document of abjuration, a retraction of her supposed errors, she agreed to sign it. Since she could not write, they guided her hand to make a crossmark. The precise terms of what she signed remained disputed. The document read publicly was short, barely a few lines. However,
The document later inserted into the official records was significantly longer and contained admissions that Joan subsequently denied ever making. In exchange for her retraction, she was promised a sentence of perpetual imprisonment instead of execution and a transfer to an ecclesiastical prison under the custody of women. But this promise, like so many others in her ordeal, was a cruel deception. She was returned to the very same cell in Rouen Castle, under the custody of the same English guards, still in her shackles. And, to complete the humiliation and set the stage for their next move, her male clothing was stripped away, leaving her with only a woman's dress. What transpired in the following days is documented in subsequent testimonies that, remarkably, are consistent across multiple witnesses. These accounts describe events so deliberately cruel, so calculated in their barbarity, that they reveal the absolute determination of her captors to manufacture the conditions necessary for her execution. According to Jean de Milly, Martin Ladvenu, a Dominican friar who assisted Joan in her final hours, and other witnesses, during the night of May 27th or 28th, the guards removed her dress. Some testimonies suggest they attempted to physically force themselves upon her. Others state they simply hid the dress.
When Joan awoke in the morning, the only clothing available to her was the male attire that had been taken from her after her abjuration. She faced an impossible choice: remain naked and utterly vulnerable in a cell with 5 hostile men, or put on the male clothing, thereby technically violating the terms of her retraction. She chose the clothing. When the guards gleefully reported this to Cauchon, the bishop declared with feigned outrage that Joan was a relapsed heretic. She had, he proclaimed, returned to her heresy and must therefore be delivered to the secular arm for immediate execution. When Joan was confronted about why she had resumed wearing male clothing after promising not to, she responded that she had never understood the promise to be permanent. She believed it applied only while she was in ecclesiastical prison, and that she had resumed the clothing because it is more appropriate for me to wear it among men than to wear women's clothing. She also declared, according to the records, that her voices had chastised her for her weakness in retracting, telling her she had condemned her soul to save her life. The trap had sprung, precisely as intended. On May 29th, Cauchon and several other clerics made a final, grim visit to Joan's cell for one last interrogation session. They asked if her voices had returned. Joan responded that they had, and that they had told her she had committed a terrible sin by abjuring to save her life, but that God had forgiven her. They pressed her, asking if she still believed the voices came from God. Her answer was resolute: "Yes, and I have no doubt of it." They asked if she understood that she would be executed. Her reply, delivered with weary defiance, cut through the pretense: "I prefer to die than to endure the suffering of this prison any longer." And when they made their final gambit, asking if she would retract again to save her life, her spirit, though bruised, remained unbroken. "If I saw myself in the fire, I would maintain all that I have said to you, and I would not say anything different." It was enough. Cauchon, with a chilling lack of surprise, declared Joan a relapsed heretic. According to canon law, the Church itself could not execute anyone. It could only declare an individual a heretic, and then hand them over to the secular arm, accompanied by a formal, utterly hollow plea for mercy. Everyone understood this to be a mere empty formula. The English government in Rouen was more than eager to comply. They scheduled her execution for the very next morning, May 30th, 1431, in the old market square of Rouen.
That last night, Martin Ladvenu and Jean de Milly remained with Joan in her cell. Ladvenu heard her final confession and administered communion, acts that were technically forbidden to condemned heretics. But he performed them because he believed, deeply, that Joan was not truly a heretic, but rather the victim of a ruthless political trial. Joan wept, not from fear of death, according to Ladvenu, but from anguish over the brutal manner of it. "Why must I be treated so cruelly that my body, never corrupted, must today be consumed and reduced to ashes?" In the morning, they dressed her in a long tunic stained with sulfur, a substance intended to make the flames more intense and excruciating. She was then placed in a cart and slowly driven through the winding streets of Rouen to the market square, where an estimated 8,000 people had gathered, a morbid sea of spectators. 3 platforms had been erected, one for the civil and religious authorities, one for Joan where her sentence would be read, and a third, towering structure,
the execution pyre itself. The pyre had been constructed unusually high, so tall that the executioner would later complain he could not reach high enough to strangle Joan before the flames consumed her. This merciful custom, designed to prevent prolonged suffering and death by fire, was denied to her. Erard delivered yet another sermon, once again denouncing Joan and, by extension, King Charles VII. Then the final sentence was read. Joan, facing her end, asked for a cross. An English soldier, perhaps moved by a flicker of humanity, fashioned a small cross from 2 pieces of wood and gave it to her. She clutched it to her chest. Jean de Mailly, acting on his own initiative, rushed to a nearby church and returned with a processional cross, which he held aloft directly in front of Joan as she was tied to the central post of the pyre. A tall paper sign was placed on her head, bearing the damning words, "Heretic, relapsed, apostate, idolater." As the fire was lit, Joan cried out repeatedly the name of Jesus. Multiple witnesses reported that her very last word, uttered as the flames enveloped her, was Jesus. The executioner, a man named Geoffrey Terrage, later declared that he had never seen anyone die with such faith and that he believed he had burned a saint. Jean Tressart, a secretary to England's King Henry VI, emerged from the execution weeping, uttering the profound words, "We are lost. We have burned a saint."
After the fire subsided, the English, determined to erase any trace of her, ordered that Joan's ashes and any remaining bone fragments be thrown into the River Seine, preventing them from becoming holy relics. In 2013, a French forensic team examined human remains, purportedly Joan's, that had been preserved in a jar in a museum since the 19th century. Analysis, however, revealed the remains were actually from an Egyptian mummy and dated to a problematic period, clearly a medieval forgery. Joan's true remains were entirely destroyed in 1431, precisely as the English had intended. 25 years later, in 1456, Pope Calixtus III authorized a new trial to examine the validity of Joan's conviction. This was called the nullification or rehabilitation process. Over 100 witnesses were interrogated, including many who had participated in the original trial or who had witnessed her captivity and execution. The new tribunal declared that the original trial had been corrupt, politically motivated, and canonically invalid. Joan was declared innocent of all charges. In 1909, she was beatified. In 1920, she was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church, and in 1922, she was declared the patron saint of France. But no post-human rehabilitation, no canonization, no national honor can ever alter what she experienced during those 11 months in Rouen Castle. A 19-year-old girl who had saved her country was sold by allies, bought by enemies, chained in a military cell, deprived of basic protection, and subjected to constant terror. She was judged in a process designed from the outset to condemn her, and finally burned alive before thousands of spectators while clutching an improvised cross of sticks. The records of her trial reveal not only the fierce determination to destroy her, but also the elaborate system constructed to legitimize that destruction. She was not merely murdered, she was processed through a legal and religious machinery that transformed political vengeance into divine justice. Dozens of educated clerics, doctors of theology and canon law, participated in a trial they knew to be fraudulent. Most remained silent for decades. Some, like Jean Lemaire, who objected and was forced to flee Rouen, paid a price for their resistance. Others, like Martin Ladvenu and Jean de Mailly, performed small acts of humanity within an inhumane system, remaining with Joan on her last night, providing her communion and holding a cross before her as she died.
But Joan herself, in the surviving fragments of her words from the trial records, emerges as someone who understood exactly what was happening, but who chose to face it with unwavering dignity. When asked if she was certain her voices came from God, knowing that asserting certainty could condemn her, she affirmed it without hesitation. When offered life in exchange for denial, she temporarily accepted, but then retracted her retraction, choosing death with integrity over life with compromise. Her final request was not for mercy or rescue, but simply for a cross to hold as she died. Historians continue to debate aspects of Joan's story, whether her voices were genuine mystical experiences or symptoms of a psychological condition, whether she truly possessed military genius or was primarily a symbolic figure, while experienced commanders made tactical decisions, and why King Charles did not attempt to rescue her or negotiate her liberation. But what is beyond dispute
is the pattern revealed by her captivity and execution. When power seeks to destroy someone, it cannot simply kill without political repercussions. It constructs an elaborate legal infrastructure to transform murder into justice. Joan's trial was meticulously designed to produce a condemnation that the English could use to discredit King Charles, arguing that he had been crowned with the aid of a witch and heretic. It required months of preparation, dozens of participants, and constant pressure on a vulnerable prisoner, kept in conditions designed to break her. And yet it almost failed. Joan responded to complex theological questions with a clarity that surprised even her interrogators. She maintained consistency in her central affirmations throughout weeks of exhaustive questioning. It was only when they placed her in a literally impossible situation, return to male clothing, or remain vulnerable to sexual violence, that they could produce the technical relapse they needed to justify her execution. How many times throughout history have systems of power constructed elaborate legal justifications to destroy individuals who threaten their control? How many trials have been theatrical performances where the verdict was already decided before the process even began? And how many voices, especially the voices of women who challenged prescribed roles, have been permanently silenced before they could truly be heard? In Rouen, in the old market square where Joan was executed, there now stands a modern church dedicated to her memory, built in 1979. It has an unusual form, designed to evoke both a funeral pyre and rising flames. At the exact spot believed to be where the pyre stood in 1431, there is a simple iron cross embedded in the ground. Tourists photograph it, French students visit it on school excursions. It is a historical site, a national monument, a place of memory.
But for Joan, in the pre-dawn hours of May 30th, 1431, listening to the echoing steps of the guards approaching her cell for the last time, there was no knowledge of future rehabilitation, of sainthood, of national memory. There was only immediate terror, anticipated pain, and the stark choice of how to face what was coming. She chose to hold an improvised cross of sticks, to utter the name of Jesus, and to maintain, until her very last breath, that the voices she had heard were real and true. If this story has confronted you with the absolute vulnerability of those who fall into the hands of merciless systems of power, please share it. Because Joan of Arc did not die merely as a victim, she died as a testimony to what occurs when religious, legal, and political institutions combine their forces to destroy someone who cannot defend themselves. The lessons of her captivity and trial remain relevant every single time we witness unchecked power exercised against unprotected individuals. Her story is not just about medieval France, it is about the permanent nature of institutional abuse and the constant need to question systems that transform injustice into a legal process.